Great. Thanks, Jason, and welcome everybody. We're so pleased that you could join us for this conversation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is George Dyer. I'm the Executive Director of the Intentional Endowments Network. I am joining today from Essex, Massachusetts, which is the ancestral land of the Pawtucket people. And we are doing these land acknowledgements at all of our sessions to really ground them in a sense of place and to keep front of mind the issues of equity and justice that underpin the urgency for climate action that we'll be talking about today. I'm very excited about today's session on the En-ROADS Climate Simulator with Jason J. and Pedro de Vasconcellos Oporto from MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative. Climate is a central theme in the Intentional Endowments Network, and we have a growing area of work around the concept of net zero portfolios. And this session is part of a series on that topic. So look out for upcoming sessions. We'll continue these conversations and various elements of these conversations in April and May. And for those of you who are not already participating in the Climate Action Pursuit, which is our year-long kind of series of programming in place of our usual annual summit, please join us for the next milestone of the pursuit, which is June 10th and 11th, where these topics will be on the agenda as well. In terms of logistics, we've got a good sized group here for some conversation. So we are in meeting mode in Zoom, but please do remain on mute while others are speaking. But I think we'll have a chance to hop in and have people ask questions and join the conversation after some presentation. We are recording the session. And video, I believe you have the ability to turn it off and on. So please do encourage you to turn it on if you're comfortable doing that. So we get a sense of conversation here. And I think that's all to cover on that. So thanks again for joining us, and I'll hand it back over to Jason and Pedro to get us into the simulator.
Excellent. Well, thanks for having us, George. Really appreciate getting to be here. I'm going to share my screen and kick off. I would just want to echo something that George just said. I would love for folks to be able to turn on their videos if you're in a place where you can. I've got a setup here where I've got a screen. I can see all of the participants and the content, and it really helps to know that how many of you I've put to sleep is a metric that I try to keep track of as I go. So what we're going to do today is we're going to work to solve global climate change in a very short amount of time, and then we're going to talk about the implications of what we've done as investors. So the problem that we're trying to solve is that we are right now heading toward a future that is 3.6 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial levels. And what the Paris Accord and the IPCC and all these other conversations are is that we need to get to a future which is a 1.5 degree future, or a 2 degree future at most. And that means significant reductions in our net emissions. Why is that important? Why is that the goal? Well, I think the simplest way to see that is through this picture that comes from the IPCC. You are here. We've already warmed the planet about 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And as a result, we are already seeing the effects of climate change. We're seeing wildfires. We're seeing tropical crop yields declining. We're seeing water scarcity in regions from South Africa to Brazil and other places. And business as usual projection, that 3.6 degree future that we're living into, is an arena where that is in the kind of purple here, which means very high risks of severe irreversible impacts with limited ability to adapt. Scientists don't like to use words like catastrophic, but this is about as close as they come. So we've got a big challenge here. Now, the good news is that there is momentum toward climate action. We saw the first ever global agreement to tackle global climate change and global warming emissions in the Paris Accord, with more than 180 countries signing on. America was wobbly, but we're back in. And so there is an effort to try to tackle this problem, but the bad news is that it is insufficient. So while the Paris Accord set 2 degrees as a goal and 1.5 degrees as an aspirational goal, if you add up the nationally determined contributions, the commitments that countries are making, and the emissions reductions that they've committed to, it only gets us to a 3.3 degree future. So we have a lot further to go, and a lot more ambitious action is needed, which is why there's all this discussion about net zero, which is what that glide path looks like here to go to net zero emissions in line with a 1.5 degree pathway. So I can show you a lot more graphs and charts like this in climate science. Research shows that showing people research doesn't work. This is a quote from our friend John Sturman, and it's actually the pre-session survey, which I asked you all to fill out, and the post-session survey is part of this research that shows that showing people research doesn't work. Instead, what works is you putting your hands on the tools where you can build your own understanding of how the energy and land use systems work, how they impact greenhouse gas emissions, how that affects temperature, and build that understanding for yourself, and with it a sense of urgency and the sense of the coordination that's required in order to do it. So what we do is we develop interactive tools, interactive simulation tools. And there are two that I'll just mention quickly. One is C-ROADS, which is the Climate Rapid Overview and Decision Support. This is a tool, as you can see, where there are different countries, US, EU, other developed, China, India, other developing. And what we can do is we can play with the emissions trajectories of different countries to see what kind of agreement would be required in order to get to a 2-degree future. And this is exactly the tool that John Holdren, John Kerry, and others had that they were using when they enter into international climate negotiations. I'm not going to go through to C-ROADS today. We're going to mostly play with En-ROADS. I'll tell you the punchline for working on C-ROADS. I'll give you a big spoiler, is that you can take all the carbon out of the US economy, the EU, the other developed countries, and the ambitious goals that Xi Jinping has set for China, and we still blow past the 2-degree and 1.5-degree targets. Unless you handle the growth of emissions in India and other developing countries and bring those down as well, we don't get to solve the climate problem. All that is just to say that climate solutions have to be global solutions. And so therefore, with the En-ROADS tool, which allows us to explore what climate solutions are actually going to work to achieve those emissions reductions, it is a globally aggregated model. So when we work the levers in En-ROADS, it's going to be action on a global scale, which is exactly what's required to tackle the challenge. And the solutions that we work on need to be scalable at that global level. A couple of just quick technical notes before we dive in to have some context around the project. This is a collaboration between the MIT Sloan School of Management, where I'm on the faculty. Pedro is a research assistant on this project. I'm not part of the core modeling team. I'm part of this research on using the tool to engage others. We work with Climate Interactive to develop the software around this. They're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank. And then we work with UMass Lowell. You may have seen there in the survey URL I sent earlier to do this evaluation research. The underlying modeling draws on data sources from the IEA, from IPCC, from all the best available peer-reviewed science in order to create this real-time interactive exploration of the climate. It is a free tool. It's available to anyone with a web browser. It's transparent. All the equations and assumptions are available in a reference guide. It is calibrated to behave the same as the big integrated assessment models, the supercomputer models that take days or weeks to run. Because it is highly aggregated and we're playing with things at a global level, that gives us some computational efficiency and allows us to play with things real time. And therefore, it is much more useful for learning and strategizing than a number of the other tools. And what we do with this is that we go out and we engage with decision makers. So on the political front, we've engaged with, so just thinking about the US political context, for example, within the Biden administration, John Kerry, Gina McCarthy, in the Senate, people like Sheldon Whitehouse, and actually more than 40 senators now, in the House of Representatives across the aisle, working with Democrats and Republicans to engage them around these tools. And then Pedro and I are leading an effort to engage with investors. We've done a number of workshops over the last couple of years with groups of family offices, some institutional investors, asset managers, and we have a couple of quotes here from Gabriel Craw at Prelude Ventures, who's a venture capital firm, and Roy Maslin at Alliance Bernstein, which is looking at more of a public equities kind of landscape. And we hope that this is a preview of what we're going to get to do together today. So we have a pretty small group here. So I think we can do this just kind of through direct interaction. I may later on use a poll everywhere tool where we can kind of get more rapid and input from everybody in the group. But for now, I just want to ask a simple question, which is, what actions will help us limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees? What is going to solve the climate challenge? And I just want to get some ideas out there, and then we're just going to go back and forth together exploring what do you think is going to solve global climate change. And I would encourage you to, if you can, I think with this size group, you can just unmute and start talking. If we collide, I'll moderate. But who's got an idea about how we can tackle greenhouse gas emissions and climate change? Which should we try?
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
It's Jonathan. So first, I really like the modeling and the framework that you're presenting. It's a great way to go. I think an important aspect of this is helping people break it down to a tactical level. So for example, I'm on the call because I'm the treasurer and chair of the endowment for the Phi Beta Kappa Foundation and Society.
Okay.
At the same time, I also serve as trustee of the village of Scarsdale where I live, and we're working on our carbon footprint and improving it. And so when I look at the C tool, I say to myself, I wonder, it's cool to talk about this stuff at the national level, but there are municipalities across the country and state officials who need to do this exact same homework.
Yes.
And I'll be done in one more moment. Like, we just had a public hearing on leaf blowers and gardeners and carbon emissions from leaf blowers. And we're adopting local regulations to encourage gardeners to go to electric leaf blowers. And I'll spare you the conversation, the detail heard on that. But if there was a tool like the C tool that was more micro, it could drive public conversations, which would accelerate change.
Yeah, absolutely. And a couple things I'll just say about that. One is that this is not the tool to end all tools. It serves a very particular purpose, which is to help people form their beliefs and understanding about the global climate challenge and what kind of actions what ensemble of actions is going to get us to a 2 or 1.5 degree future, and therefore to prioritize our various different efforts. The second thing I'll say is that, and there are other tools which help us look at a national level or those more granular, municipal and state levels. That's not what these tools do, but offline we can talk about what else is out there. The second thing is that I would encourage you.
I think that would accelerate the change. Like, the more people.
Of course. Yeah, but the other thing I'll say is that I would encourage you. So one of the button here in the lower right of the screen says En-ROADS Climate Ambassador Training. After this experience today, I would encourage any and all of you who want to go get trained for free as an ambassador using this tool, and then you can go and have the conversations in whatever context is relevant for you, inside your endowments, with other investors, in the municipalities where you operate. But given that we're playing today with a globally aggregated tool, I'd love to hear some suggestions from the group about what kinds of levers do you think are going to be most impactful in tackling climate change? And these could be technologies, behaviors, policies. What's going to get us to where we want to go? Madeira, go ahead.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
You gave us the answers right there.
Okay.
All of the above. I guess the way we look at it is we know that this is urgent, and there's one thing that will solve it. We really need to attack it from all directions. And I feel like it's important that each of us look at what is it that we can influence and go and influence the best we can. So I work with Capricorn Investment Group,
Yes.
firm. So I look at it from an investor perspective, and there's at a very high level 2 things that we're doing. One is investing in new technologies, which we think will be key to making progress on this. The second is we also hold shares in publicly traded companies, so shareholder engagement there. So really understanding the data and understanding what of our companies is doing and pushing them in the right direction.
Yes.
Energy companies, for example, making sure that they increase their mix of renewable energy as fast as they can.
Yes.
with CDP, for example, to make sure that companies collectively all disclose on their emissions and sign up to science-based targets. Just a couple that we're doing, and I think there's a lot more that can be done on the policy side.
Yes.
We can't be directly involved in, but all very important.
Excellent. So let me just talk for a second about this kind of from the investor perspective, right? Is that you've described, investors, the levers that we have available to us as investors have a couple of different flavors to them. So we have, and we've sort of broken this up as ride the wave, meaning kind of a little bit more indirect impact, and make the wave, meaning direct impact. And this axis here is actually based on research by our colleague Julian Coble and others who have looked at what's the evidence base for the impact of investors on the real world. Mandira, what you're talking about with respect to Capricorn is providing capital to new enterprises to get new technologies off the ground, and using shareholder engagement to try to drive companies to kind of improve their practices. So that's fantastic. These are the levers that we have available to us as investors. Some of these, as we say, kind of make the wave, and some of them end up performing better as that wave crests. So as we, investing in an ETF around electric vehicles, for example, has been a very good bet over the last year. You're sort of riding the wave there, providing some capital. There is some impact of doing that. That it's just a little bit more indirect. So these are absolutely the levers. Now I'm just going to pull out one specific thing that you said, Mandira, which was when we're doing engagement with companies, we want to get them to adopt more renewable energy. So I think that's a fantastic idea. I know that Capricorn is also involved in investing in early stage renewable energy technologies. So let's play with that lever in the En-ROADS tool. If I pull, when we play with the renewables lever, when we pull this up, essentially what we're doing is we're encouraging more renewable energy, and we could do that through these investor levers as well as through public policy levers like renewable portfolio standards, or corporate levers, like if I'm in Google and I'm setting 100% renewable energy target. So I'm going to encourage renewable energy. Before I click here, I want everyone here to just form a mental hypothesis of what's going to happen when I pull that lever. And then I'm going to do it. Okay, so what we've done is we've just encouraged renewable energy pretty significantly. Our base case model does have a pretty good amount of growth. That's this black line of renewable energy. The scale is changing here as we increase. So we're going from about 325 exajoules a year of renewables by the end of the century to more like 450 or 500. So we are expanding our renewable energy base pretty substantially. And you can see that reflected in this left graph where the band of green renewable energy is increasing. And you see some substitution away from the coal, oil, and gas that we have. And as a result of that, we see some reduction in this gray band of energy-related CO2 emissions. And as a result of those lower emissions, we have less concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we have a 1/10 of a degree less warming by the end of the century than we otherwise would have had. So this is why I'd love to have like everybody with their videos on if you could, because I can just get you to wave and raise your hand if this is a bigger change than you thought it was going to be and keeping in mind this is a globally aggregated model, so we're doing this all around the world. Raise your hand if this was a bigger change than you thought it was going to be. Okay. If it was a smaller change than you thought it was going to be, raise your hand. Okay. If this was about what you expected. Okay, so so it was a mix of different points of view. So let's try to understand what's going on here. As I mentioned, the greenhouse gas benefit we're getting from renewables is when they substitute away from coal, oil, and natural gas. But not all of this is substitution. In fact, if we make renewables cheaper, people will use more energy overall. So the height of this mountain is increasing very slightly. And that means that we're just adding renewables. So this is like in Germany when they added a lot of renewable capacity, didn't take the coal plants offline, you're still burning coal, oil, and natural gas, putting emissions into the air along the way. And so that's part of the picture. And that's kind of like the big part of the story here. So Mandira, you said when we think about Capricorn, we think about a family of approaches. Let's hear from some others in the group about what are some of the other things that we can do that we think are going to have an impact on this picture? What are some other actions we can take besides encouraging renewables? I'm a business school professor, so I'm very comfortable with cold calling.
I can go.
Go ahead, Carolina.
Hi, yeah, Carolina. I'm from Winslow Capital, for those of you who I haven't met, but in addition to subsidizing renewables, you could tax the coal and the oil to discourage that. Okay,
so let's try taxing coal and oil. So I'll add a tax on coal at a pretty ambitious level. That's going to give us another, that's going to take us from 3.5 to 3.4. So that's worth 1/10 of a degree. And taxing oil is going to get us another 1/10 of a degree. So those are things that are going to slow down our use of those resources. If we dive in here, we can see what that tax does in terms of reducing that primary energy demand from coal and reducing that primary energy demand from oil. There is clearly some price elasticity, although it's not completely taking it off the board. It is a very significant action to take. Now, how can we do that? So we can, again, try to imagine this. We can think of this as a public policy maneuver. We can also think of this as other forms of increasing the effective cost of coal. So as for us as investors, that means increasing their cost of capital, increasing operating costs or their premiums on insurance, and other things which may be possible through the financial levers. So that's great. Others in the group. Jonathan, you have a suggestion of something to try?
Yes. Well, I'll just throw out three things. One, we haven't touched land, agriculture, and farming that impacts on methane. So changing how people eat is part of it. I don't see the easy button to push on that one.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So let's start with that one. So let's start with the way people eat, and let's get even more specific than that, because we actually can play with a few things related to the agriculture system. What particular changes in the way people eat would you like to see, Jonathan?
Well, I'll throw out some red meat to the audience. No pun intended. Actually, pun intended. Okay. So if we could get people to adopt less red meat rich diets,
okay,
more fish, more vegetarian based.
Okay, great. So all right. So you are one of those people who's trying to take away all of our hamburgers. So let's see what happens. Now, there's a few things that happen when we reduce meat consumption. So one of them is that we're going to have an effect on. So we've got a nice little cow here to recognize this lever that Jonathan identified. If we go to the detailed settings here, we can play with the agricultural and waste emissions related to methane and nitrous oxide. So here we're going to be going directly after the methane that is belched by cows as a result of their enteric fermentation, as well as other methane and nitrous oxide emissions in the agricultural system, like in rice cultivation and so on. But the vast majority of this is through animal agriculture. So when I click this, what we're going to do is reduce is put us on a glide path of steady reductions in methane from agriculture. Okay, so again, formulate a hypothesis of what we're going to see, and so what you see here is that this light blue band here of methane is reducing, and because methane and it's actually a pretty modest reduction in the amount of methane that we're emitting as a human civilization, but it has a pretty good effect of 1/10 of a degree of Celsius, precisely because methane is such a strong greenhouse gas. Now, reducing the meat we eat isn't just about methane. The land use required to do the cultivation of the feeds for the cattle, whether that's corn or soy, is also pretty land extensive and tends to put pressure on forests. So if we're going to reduce beef consumption, I also like to pull a little to reduce deforestation a bit, because to reflect the lower pressures on forests that come from those changes. So here what you see is there's about 4.5 gigatons a year of land use emissions that are primarily about deforestation. If we slow down that rate of deforestation, so which is what this lever is going to do. Let's see what that does. And so now what we've done is we've essentially slowed and stopped deforestation, going to zero net, kind of land use emissions by the end of the century. So that combination of things is usually what people are trying to capture when they're looking at these this like meat reduction, and together that was worth another 0.2 of a degree of avoided warming. So thank you for that, Jonathan. Let's go to someone else in the group we haven't heard from yet.
There was a call for.
Jason.
Oh,
Biljana, go ahead.
Thank you, Jason. So just to kind of piggyback on Jonathan, I was surprised to learn how much CO2 can be recaptured by soil. So perhaps looking at changing agricultural practices and removing tillage and moving away from single crops that you mentioned.
Beautiful. Okay, so under technological carbon removal, which is just sort of carbon removal that isn't trees, we have a variety of different technologies that are in discussion right now for carbon removal. And those include BECCS, which is essentially growing crops and then burning and sequestering the carbon, direct air capture, which are vacuum cleaners pulling CO2 out of the sky, enhanced mineralization, which is laying out CO2 reactive minerals onto the ground to absorb CO2, and then what you're talking about here, which is agricultural soil carbon sequestration. So this is a result of regenerative agriculture practices that might cause more root growth, more placing of carbon and other organic material into the soil. And so there's a technical potential that's been assessed for agricultural soil carbon sequestration. And by the way, I should say that all of the assumptions in this tool are visible and available for you to play with. So if you go to simulation, you choose assumptions, you get this screen where you can where you can kind of play with the underlying assumptions, as well as see where the science comes from. So on ag soil carbon, for example, we're using this Royal Society Academy of Engineering study about what is the full technical potential we could achieve if we were to do soil carbon sequestration. So let's give that a try, and let's do a really ambitious global plan of regenerative agriculture practices and achieve, let's say, 75% of potential in soil carbon sequestration. Okay, I'm going to hit enter. We'll see what happens. And that was worth another 0.1 of a degree. So what you see here now, so Biljana, is Biljana the right pronunciation, or is it Biljana?
Biljana.
Biljana. Okay, sorry. So Biljana, how does that compare to your expectations, what we just saw?
It's quite a bit lower than I had hoped,
Okay.
Given the numbers, like what I've seen or what was claimed, like what proportion of carbon dioxide it can remove from the environment.
Yes. So, again, look at the science on this. There's estimates about, per hectare, how much carbon we can sequester into the soils. And it is a pretty significant amount of carbon. I mean, we're talking about gigaton scale solution here, 3.5 gigatons of carbon per year being sequestered in the soils. Now, we just want to notice a couple things about that number. One is that we're putting carbon in the soils, we're continuing to absorb it, but over time, we are saturating the soils. So there is a gradual decline in the amount per year of CO2 that we're putting into the soil. But there's also just a scale challenge here. So what we've done on this upper graph here, when we do this, is we've added this gray band here of negative emissions. And that 3.5 gigatons of sequestration is happening at the same time that we're continuing to emit 37 gigatons from the energy system. An additional 9 gigatons of methane, 9.7 gigatons of methane largely from the industrial system because Jonathan helped us with our agricultural emissions. So one of the things that I think is really important to one of the intuitions that we're trying to build here is this intuition about stocks and flows and what we call the bathtub dynamics of the climate system. Many of us have taken baths. Some of us do dishes in a sink on a regular basis. It's the same kind of system. You have an inflow, which is the faucet. There's an outflow, which is the drain. This is stock and flow notation from system dynamics, which is the underlying methodology here, is that you've got a stock, which is like what's in the tub, and then the inflow and the outflow. The atmosphere is like a bathtub. So when we are emitting greenhouse gases every year, we are turning on that faucet. And when we do things like plant trees or put soil into the ground, we're removing carbon from the atmosphere. When removals are equal to emissions, the concentration stays flat. When removals exceed emissions, so when the drain is open faster than the sink, then the sink is going to empty out. And so we need our removals to exceed our emissions in order for the concentration to go down. And that's just not going to happen here with this scale of 10 times as many emissions from our energy system as we're trying to sequester in any given year. So it is an important piece of the puzzle. And I should say, I'm kind of biasing the conversation by only looking at graphs about greenhouse gases here. There's a lot of other good reasons to use less land, to stop deforestation, to sequester carbon in soils. It makes the soils retain water better, makes them more climate resilient. Forests have all kinds of benefits in terms of habitat, soil erosion, and everything else. But just from a carbon perspective, it's not going to get us where yet. It's a piece of the puzzle, but we need more. We need to add more. So who else haven't we heard from yet that has some ideas about what we can add to our picture here?
There are some calls for carbon pricing in the chat.
Okay, carbon pricing in the chat. So let's take a look at that. The idea of a carbon price, as you may be familiar, is this idea that right now it is free for me to pollute. I can drive all around, I can run my factory, I can run my power plant, and I'm using the atmosphere, and all of us are paying some cost for that, but I don't have to pay it as a polluter. The idea behind a carbon price is to create a price of using the atmosphere and to what economists call internalize the externalities. So we can play with a carbon price, and there's a lot of detail here we can play with in terms of the time for ramping it up and so on. But let's try working with a carbon price here. Now, as many people don't know how to calibrate the size of a carbon price to other things that they understand in the economy. Now, financial analysts, many of you may have done some scenario testing on this in your portfolios, and you have like a more granular quantitative idea. One thing I find really useful is the following, which is every 10 cents of carbon tax every dollar of carbon tax is about every 10 cents of carbon tax is about I'm totally messing up my math here. I'm jumping ahead to calculation, so I'm just going to say the thing that I actually know, which is that $100 price on carbon adds about 90 cents to a gallon of gasoline. So a $100 price, I didn't want to say $100 price on carbon because sometimes that number sort of scares people, but if we say $100 price on carbon, that means about a 90 cent per gallon price on gasoline. So if you imagine going to the gas to go fill up a gas, it's $2.50. I don't know what the current price is, but that's recent. Imagine it being $3.40 instead. That's the kind of change to our energy economics that would be reflected by a $100 price on carbon. There are various different proposals for how big a price on carbon should be. Javier in the chat says that in Canada we have a federal carbon tax. Right now we're at $30. But we're growing it over time. So let's try that. What we're doing here is we're ramping up a carbon price over time. So if I put a $100 price on carbon here, it's not instantly. If we had been working towards it over 3 years, we'd get to that $30. Right now we're ramping it up over 10 years. So when I push enter, we're going to see the effect of a $100 price on carbon ramped up over 10 years. Okay, so that one move got us 0.5 of a degree. Every other move that we've made so far got us 1/10 or slightly less than 1/10, but ended up adding up together. So we got 0.5 degree out of that one move of the $100 price on carbon. Why is this such a powerful lever? Well, what I'll do is I'm gonna push this little replay button so you can see what it's doing on these different graphs. So first on the lower right, you can see we're just ramping up a carbon price, and I'll show you the economic effects of that in a moment.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
I'm guessing implicit in this is some sort of elasticity of demand model.
Correct.
Maybe you can just give us 2 seconds on that. And I guess some sort of substitution effect that says, because of this tax, people are going to go to blah, blah, blah at some
Beautiful.
reasonable price thereof.
Beautiful, beautiful. Absolutely. So first, let me show you kind of a macroeconomic. Well, first let me show you a microeconomic view, and then a macroeconomic view to help you understand that. So, so first of all, when you click on the title bars for these graphs, there's a whole variety of different things we can look at. Let's look at the financial, like the average cost of electricity production by source. So, so here, if I undo our carbon price, this is kind of what's going on in the current picture. Now, we've already added a tax on oil and a tax on coal because of Carolina's intervention. So that's why we're seeing this increase in the price of oil and this increase in the price of coal as a result of those taxes we already imposed. When we add this carbon price, what we're going to see is, and you can see that the renewable price is decreasing over time just due to learning curves. The more we build, the better we get at it. That's a phenomenon that's easy to calibrate to past data. And so we have the crossover point here. You know, it happens gradually across the world, but you can see the timing and you know, there's still going to be some markets in which it's favorable to do coal, which is why you still see this on the board. When we go to $100 price on carbon, what happens is we're dramatically increasing the effective cost of our coal, our gas, coal, and oil, and relative to renewables. And so what we're going to do is it's going to drive an increase in our adoption of renewable energy because of that microeconomic substitution effect at the level of the electric utility that's trying to decide what kind of infrastructure to build. The other important effect here is on our energy use. So, so if I go back to this picture of our energy demand, what a carbon price is going to do is you're going to see that we're substituting away coal, oil, and gas for renewables, but the overall height of the mountain is also decreasing. And that's because we've just made all energy consumption overall a little bit more expensive. And so people are now going to be adopting LED bulbs faster, hybrid cars faster, and other forms of energy efficiency measures much more quickly, as well as making behavioral moves like mode shifting transportation from truck to rail for freight, or from car to bus for personal mobility. And so because it is simultaneously having an effect on all these activities sort of proportional to their emissions, it turns out to be a very efficient way to go after emissions. And it's why economists like Chris Knittel on our faculty will spend a lot of time advocating for a carbon price. Now, some people have concerns about the economic effects of a carbon price. It's important to look at that question. So if we look at our total annual cost of energy, we did increase the price of energy. Now you'll notice that we kind of drifted back toward what the baseline would have been because the economy adjusts by adopting these energy efficiency and conservation measures. But if you were worried about the economic disruption of that, you could spread out that $100 price of carbon more gradually over 20 years so that the economy can adapt a little bit. We lose 1/10 of a degree by that delayed action, but we might be able to accommodate it more easily economically. Okay, so that's our carbon price. We're doing great, team. We've got ourselves from 3.6 down to 2.5 degrees. Sorry, was someone trying to talk?
Yeah, sorry, that was Indira. I was just curious what your assumption was in the model for the current price of carbon, or if you have any price in there.
Oh, great question. So the average effective price of carbon in the world right now is very close to zero. Now, that's not that carbon pricing doesn't already exist. In fact, carbon pricing exists in a number of jurisdictions around the world, and carbon pricing does cover a significant portion of global emissions. So this is a map from the World Bank of the geographies in which carbon pricing is being implemented, and you can see that there is about 11 gigatons a year of global emissions that are covered by some form of carbon pricing regime. But when we're only covering about 20% of our emissions with carbon pricing, and those carbon prices are in kind of experimental low levels, like the $30 described in Canada, or sometimes the EU price drifts as low as $5 or $10. On an average basis, it's we're not currently modeling it as significant, but I think that's a really good point, because we're always trying to catch up with where the world is going. And it may be that that if you're playing with this tool and doing some scenario analysis with this tool, you might want to have sort of a base case with carbon pricing higher than we assume it's going to be, than we assume it is in the base case. The idea behind the base case here, the sort of default scenario, is just that, and what I've done here is just open up a separate browser tab with a clean model so we can see what that base case was, is that it's just as if we have no action beyond what has already been, credibly committed to.
Thank you.
Okay, so other ideas for what we can add to our picture here in tackling emissions. We've made some major progress to get to 2.5, but we've got another, I think, 8 or 9 people on the call that we haven't heard from yet, and a few things that we haven't yet tried. So what's going to help us? Andrew, help us out.
Sure. So I think this will probably be something that we see, depending on the modeling, like 2035 or onward, would be the kind of new zero carbon, which would be like nuclear fusion or green hydrogen, possibly coming down in cost to where it's a feasible option. Okay,
so new zero carbon. Sorry, my throat's bothering me. I just ran out of water here. So new zero carbon. So what happens here is that these are technologies like nuclear fusion, thorium-based fission. The idea here is that it is a technology which emits zero carbon and is cheaper than coal, or at least gets to be cheaper than coal quite quickly. So the initial cost relative to coal is two, and then that declines over time with a learning curve. So what we can do is we can get a breakthrough or a huge breakthrough in those technologies and see what that does on the board. So let's get a breakthrough, as you said, Andrew, in that 2030 timeframe of a new source of generation. And what you see here is this new orange band has appeared of new zero emissions technology. And you can see that's ramping up to be a pretty significant portion of our global energy supply. And there are, as I said with forests, there are good reasons to do this. It's providing us with potentially sort of base load greenhouse, gas-free electricity. But look what's going on here with emissions and temperature. In our current setup, we have essentially no change in emissions or in final temperature. It's showing up as a 10th degree Fahrenheit. Why is that? What's going on here, Andrew?
I'm guessing probably we're keeping our electricity consumption increasing, or population is going up, something along those lines that would not sort of offset any of the other uses of energy from the other sources. Okay, so that's part of it, is that, energy consumption is continuing to increase. As you mentioned, that's partly a result of, population, growth of global economies. We can decarbonize our energy supply, but as long as we're kind of continuing to grow our energy usage, that is a factor, absolutely. But there's another phenomenon here. I want you to watch very closely. What is our new carbon substituting away from in the current picture? What is decreasing as a result of the increase in the orange?
Renewables.
Looks like just renewables, but
Exactly. So we've already done so much to decarbonize the energy supply here and get renewables on the board that when we put that fusion on the board, it's not helping us that much incrementally, because it's substituting for solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal. Let me just show you what it looks like if we didn't do all those other policies. We go back to a clean model, and all we do is a breakthrough in that nuclear fusion. Then we do see a 1/10 of a degree difference. Because we're getting more substitution away from the coal, oil, and gas. But this is oftentimes a smaller change than people think it's going to be. In fact, the original version of this tool we developed in order to communicate with Bill Gates. when he was first getting into the climate arena, he said, we just need to invent fusion and that's going to solve the problem. And we use this tool to help illustrate actually, it takes a long time for a new technology to grow. You've got to build out the supply chain, the knowledge capabilities. Building these facilities takes time to ramp up. And all that time you're burning coal, oil, and gas. And it doesn't automatically substitute away for fossil fuels. It can just add new energy to the mix. And now if you look at Breakthrough Energy Ventures and Gates's other efforts, you'll see a much more of a portfolio-based approach. We can't take credit for that alone, but it's part of this. It's part of this kind of thinking. So it can be part of a future. It's just that in our current scenario with these other things going on, we're already doing a lot of renewables.
Can you bring up, since you bring up Bill Gates, excellent point. I brought up in the chat, one of the problems that Bill Gates sees actually is energy storage costs as a problem with wind and solar, and he is on record saying that now. So I'd be curious, because I think a lot of your assumptions are hinging on battery technology becoming affordable, and there are still a lot of doubts in that model. And I think you look at it, what we would need is a large long-term storage, not just this 4-hour variety. We saw this in Texas where, wind basically went down to nothing even before our storms. How does that modeling work? And I think that's, part of the problem, and I guess, some of the complexities of this model. That I'd be curious how you work that through, because that, I think, probably limits the effect of the new technology.
Yeah, Andrew, it's a great point. So the way that we deal with this is, this gets very complex, right? I mean, if you look at, so for example, if you look at Google's strategy for going to 100% renewable energy, they are doing some very fancy stuff in terms of being able to load shift their computational load to locations where the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. They're looking at complementarities between solar and wind in Chile, in northern and southern Chile, for example, in order to get to 80% renewables in Chile. The micro level grid dynamics of energy storage and sort of arbitrage are quite interesting and complex, and we don't model them in this. And so I don't want to set expectations like we've got all of that under the hood, because we don't. The way that we do this as a simplifying thing is that when we have renewable energy deploying in this picture, it is deploying with enough storage that it can operate essentially the same as baseload power. So that's why actually our ramp up of renewable energy looks slower than Bloomberg New Energy Finance and some other modeling efforts, because we're saying, exactly what Gates is saying, which is you need the storage to be able to deal with the intermittency of the renewables. And so a breakthrough cost reduction in storage. So we put all the storage stuff under the renewables section, and a big reduction in storage costs does allow you to ramp up your renewable energy a little faster. And so you'll see on the right graph here that renewables are going to increase a bit more if you can get the storage costs down. Essentially what's going on under the hood here is that is this picture I showed earlier about the average cost of electricity production by source, is that just the raw generation technologies of renewables are getting cheap so fast that that even if storage remains at the current price, the overall system level cost is declining. We've already reached grid parity in certain contexts, and so you're still going to get deployment of those technologies at a pretty good clip. Okay, I want to. So I'm watching time here, and there's a couple things that I want to do. So one is that I want us to get a couple more ideas out here on the board that will get us across the finish line to 2 degrees, because I think it's really important that people see that it's possible, but also what it takes. So a couple things that that folks haven't. So one is I'm going to look at is electrification of transport and buildings that was suggested by Sydney. So let's take a look at that. So right now in this picture, we've added a lot of zero carbon electricity, but we really haven't done that much to the transportation sector. And as a result of that, oil, which we primarily use for transportation, isn't far off of, in 2100 of current levels. And you can see in the base case picture, what that looked like. We did take a dent out of oil through those taxes, but if people can't substitute away from oil, then the whole system is much harder to shift. So if we electrify transport in the current picture, that is going to help us to reduce our oil consumption in a way that we haven't yet been able to do, and shift some of that demand over to our low carbon energy supply from our fusion. It's worth about 1/10 of a degree in this picture. You have to be careful in a base case picture. If you increase electrification, you can actually increase the amount of coal consumption that happens. So, but because we've taxed coal and carbon priced ourselves, like those things are going to be complementary. And then actually electrification of buildings and industry is a very significant lever. So that's actually worth 2/10 of a degree here if we can really significantly ramp up the electrification of processes like steel manufacturing, but also mostly just in the building stock, being able to move to things like air source heat pumps and ventilation system, heat recovery ventilation systems, induction stoves, and the like, that allow us to, in particular, work away from the natural gas. So you'll see this has a particular effect on the blue band of natural gas. So we've added those electrification things, and then Mandira adds one more thing here, which is further carbon capture technologies. So before, what we did was we just did soil-based carbon sequestration. Let's try an approach where, in the same way that we used a carbon price to kind of spread our bets on different carbon emissions reduction approaches, let's spend that carbon price on a mix of technological approaches to remove carbon. And that's going to give us a nice band of negative emissions here that is, now you can see, is in the order of magnitude where it's really helping us get to a kind of net zero place. And then the other piece of this that we were very close to trying but didn't is around industrial methane. Rather than go to that, Jonathan suggests we haven't touched population and economic growth. Is it too draconian but maybe impactful? In fact, so we can play with the UN, with the forecast of population. There are some highly ethical and highly wonderful ways to go about slowing population growth, which have to do with providing economic and educational opportunities to girls and young women in emerging markets. The research shows that speeds the demographic, that essentially is a critical part of the demographic transition. And so if we look at the population growth by region, a lot of the growth is happening in emerging markets where you have large family sizes. If we pull this lever down, it's not a Thanos button for those Marvel fans out there. This is just slowing the growth of population, particularly in emerging markets. And that is going to give us another 1/10 of a degree. If you look at Paul Hawkins' book Drawdown, you'll see a few solutions that are in this space of girls and women's empowerment in emerging markets. And now, with just the suggestions that you've made here, we've gotten to a 2-degree future. So I want us to just all take a quick pause and a deep breath and recognize what we've seen here. So just a moment of silence and contemplate what this would have to look like in the real world. My response to this is that, we clearly can see what's possible. And even, and using facilitator's privilege here, even if we pull that nuclear fusion breakthrough off the board, we're still at a 2-degree future without any magical technological sort of waves of the wand. This is all things that require tremendous degrees of coordination, political will, and action on our part as investors and as citizens. But it is a possible future, and one that is significantly safer and better for our economies, our children, our grandchildren, and all the children. So what I encourage you to do is to pick up where we left off. I'll put that net zero back on the board. I'm going to copy and paste into the chat a link to not just the simulation, but this is literally our scenario that we created together. And so you can play with pulling some of these things off or on and get into it yourself. I also encourage you to press this button on the lower right about the En-ROADS Climate Ambassador training, where you can learn more about what it takes to go be an ambassador to bring this into conversations inside your organizations and beyond. And of course, you're welcome to reach out to us if you'd like help with any of that. What we're seeing right now is very significant movement in the investor world to take on these actions of engagement, providing capital, divestment, thematic investing, and so on. There are coalitions forming around net zero, asset owners and managers alliances, Climate Action 100 to, even our Matimco endowment at MIT is part of Climate Action 100, working to do shareholder engagement to drive disclosure and decarbonization. All of us have a role to play. And what I hope is that today you've gotten a chance to see sort of the magnitude and complexity of that challenge, but what's possible through a coordinated portfolio-based approach, which is what we heard at the beginning of our conversation from Andira at Capricorn, saying it's going to be a family of different approaches. I hope that we can have all of you in that fight, in that journey. The last thing is just those of you, particularly if you filled out the pre-session survey, would love for you to fill out this post-session survey, which will capture some of the, whatever sort of change in your perspective or not may have occurred as a result of the session. And this is an important part of that research, exploring the impact and the possibilities for conversations like what we just had today. I'm sorry for going over by a minute, but really appreciate George and the Intentional Endowments Network for hosting this. And I'm happy to stick around for a couple of minutes if folks want to chat.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jason. And we'll let folks go who need to for time, but thank you all for joining us. This is both daunting and hopeful and exciting and just amazing to see what's in this tool. And I think a really powerful tool for reminding us all and deepening our knowledge about what needs to be done and how we as investors and others can do it. So we can definitely leave this space open. I know we could keep going all day on this, and maybe there are opportunities to do more. But for those who do have to go, thank you again for joining us. And for those who do want to stick around for a few minutes, we can do that and leave the Zoom room open.